in just a few months, hundreds of millions of people around the world will turn to London and the Summer Olympic Games to see world-class athletes in some amazing competition. But for a couple of dozen research geeks at NBC Universal, the Olympics are not about sports at all. What they are about is the $1 Billion Lab, a unique opportunity to measure how the Olympics are consumed and to catch a glimpse of the future of media. Now, here's what makes the $1 Billion Lab such a unique and remarkable research opportunity. First of all, it's a huge amount of content across 4 platforms. And that content is consumed in enormous proportions. Whether it's TV ratings, unique visitors, or page views, Olympic consumption dwarfs every other media event. And third, unlike big events like the Super Bowl, the Academy Awards, the Golden Globes, the Olympics takes place across 17 days. So we can see trends develop and evolve over that period of time. For example, how do consumers follow the Olympics on different platforms during the morning commute versus prime time at home? That's something we just can't study for a single telecast like the Super Bowl or even prime time. Or when people begin to maybe get some new behaviors like using mobile, will they increase that use over the 17 days? Well, what all this does is it accelerates the behavior of the consumer. And that increases the measurable effect. We can see consumer behavior in ways which aren't easily measurable under ordinary circumstances. So in a nutshell, what the $1 Billion Lab does is it helps us see the future of consumer behavior, but equally important for folks in this room, the future of measurement. Just to give you a very quick sense of what the content is, on television, the Olympics will be broadcast across 2 broadcast networks, NBC and Telemundo, 4 cable networks, the NBC Sports Network, CNBC, MSNBC, and Bravo. And that's going to be 835 hours, 280 in broadcast, 555 in cable. That's an average of 49 hours a day of Olympic content. Just the NBC TV network alone will have 16 hours. But we're also obviously on digital. There'll be over 3,000 hours of live streams on NBCOlympics.com. And mobile and tablets will have about 3,200 hours of live streams. And none of this includes, pulling down and downloading or specific clips and content. Now, measuring all of the content of the Olympics is obviously our job one. But what makes this lab so interesting is that we can also use it to gain insight into emerging media behavior. And to do that, we employ a variety of research methods. And one of the most interesting is ethnography, or I should say Duke John of ethnography. John Carey, I think, is one of the best ethnographers out there. And what he does for us, and he's done it for all the Olympic labs, he speaks to around 40 respondents. And he interviews them in their home and quite often also in their workplace. And we hear from them how they think about things, why they do what they do, and it's a great match. It's kind of like a way to fill in the bones of quantitative of analysis. So London's our 3rd lab. As I said, the first began in Beijing, and here are some of the key highlights that we found then in 2008. First, TV was king. Regardless of newly emerging platforms, TV is still the dominant way people consume Olympic content. I think yesterday, Artie Bogren mentioned, the idea of the best possible screen, and there's no question that that's what this is about. Secondly, digital content definitely complements TV and actually results in increased TV viewing. We found that those who use both the internet and television during Beijing watched significantly more television than those who just consumed it on TV. Third, cross-platform. Now, cross-platform, and there were only 3 screens there, it was TV, PC, internet, and mobile, was really in its infancy. But, somewhat to our amazement, we could actually measure it. We could produce true single-source data, and single source meaning the same person is giving us information about their TV use, their PC use, and their mobile use. We could actually do it. It sounds simple, but believe me, it wasn't. Fourth, the digitally the digital platforms increased the interest among younger viewers in the Olympics. Candidly, the Olympics was beginning to fade in the early part of 2000s among younger viewers. But the fact that by Beijing we were able to exploit digital platforms in ways we couldn't before made it much more relevant to them. And the fact of the matter is, it increased their interest in the games. And finally, mobile. Well, it just wasn't ready for prime time. You got to remember, 2008, it was 2007 when the iPhone just came out. It had only been released a year earlier, and it was pretty much the only viable smartphone that was out there. And a smartphone is a phone that enables the consumer to have a really good video experience. Well, just 2 years later, we went into Vancouver, and here are some of the things we found. TV, still king. The use of the internet and mobile had significantly increased, and more importantly, was mainstreaming. It wasn't just 25-year-old kids in Soho wearing black anymore. It was a lot of people. Fully 1/3 of Olympic consumers engaged in some sort of simultaneous use during the games. And the increasing use of digital content resulted in increased interest in those younger consumers. In fact, viewing among adults 18 to 24 grew by 49%. And finally, the emergence of mobile video and the internet. It began to show up. It was 3 years now, and iPhones began to penetrate, not hugely, but in some ways significantly. And that penetration is still relatively small. And don't forget, when we had Vancouver in 2010, the iPad hadn't even appeared yet. It wouldn't appear until about 6 weeks later. But we were able to see some emerging trends, one of which was the shift from WAP, the mobile browser, to an app. Now, I know talking in front of you guys today in 2012, that sounds like a duh moment. But honestly, in those days, apps were very, very new, and we saw, though, that they were hugely valued by the consumer, and it was a significant insight. So what are we going to look for in London? There are 4 basic research initiatives. The first is obviously understanding cross-platform. It's central to everything that we do, and we're going to measure simultaneous use as well. The second is social media, the who, what, where, when, and how of social networking. Third, advertising effectiveness. The Olympics is probably the gold standard of advertising across a variety of platforms, and we want to understand the power of that platform and also how to measure cross-platform ROI better. And then finally, we're going to continue our ethnography. We want to listen to our consumers and their research. But at every instance, in everything that we do, we're going to try to take the research method to the next level. New and improved is our mantra. So let's take a quick look at cross-platform. There'll be more users, we think. Will it be more mainstream? And will we have a rise of the thymus? Now, the thymus is not a creature from the Black Lagoon, nor a Jewish dish my grandmother made featuring carrots. That's a simus, okay? It's a simultaneous media user. And how they will play an increasingly important role in media, not just for the Olympics, but going forward, is something that we think is going to be pretty important. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's take a look at the evolution of cross-platform behavior measurement. Back in the day, and that was 2008, we were trying to measure 3 screens. And we could produce single-source ratings using a proprietary audio recognition methodology by a company called IMMI. It featured a phone that recognized audio signatures from TV content, and it linked it to an individual respondent. And then IMMI software also measured mobile use, such as it was in those days, and a software meter on the PC produced internet measurement, but then only for NBCOlympic.com. Our panel consisted of 40 Olympic enthusiasts. We wanted people who we thought were going to watch the Olympics. We didn't want to waste one of those valuable phones on kind of empty research calories, somebody who just really wouldn't be using it. And you know, honestly, it was the research equivalent of the Wright brothers' first flight. You know, it was primitive, it was limited, but damn it, it flew, and it showed that we could produce some single-source cross-platform data. Now, 2 years later, in February of 2010, cross-platform advanced, as did our ability to measure it. We grew the number of websites we measured from 1 to 47, giving us a much more dimensional look at the internet platform, and we participated with Arbitron in terms of the first truly in the field, in the real world, 2-screen measurement of TV and the internet. And those results were generalizable to a larger population. And now, here we are in London. First, we will measure 4 screens with the addition of the tablet, a device I think everybody in this room realizes will have a huge impact on video consumption going forward. And because cross-platform is at the heart of the billion-dollar lab, we're going to measure it using 2 major initiatives, one with ComScore, the other with Google. And we'll also have a nationally representative sample measuring out-of-home Olympic viewing, because we think that's going to be significant. Arbitron's going to do that for us. So let me talk to you about each of these going forward. The ComScore study is a single-source passive and self-report study, combining those 2, in and out of the home. They're going to use about 750 tech-forward Olympic enthusiasts that we're recruiting. And again, it may not be nationally representative, but we do want to do everything we can to understand some of this behavior. They'll be recruited from a set-top box telco population, and the viewing data will be augmented with a self-report electronic diary, so we can apply demos to the set-top box data, because set-top box data doesn't have demos. And the self-report diary can also help us measure out-of-home viewing on all of the other devices. And what we hope to have is a day-in-the-life measure that takes us far beyond what we could do in Vancouver. The sample is going to be more than 10 times the size of earlier Olympic enthusiast panels, and that's going to give us a much better opportunity for a deep dive on a lot of these behaviors. The next is our partnership with Google. It's a little different. Google will be recruiting a panel of about 3,000 panelists and use a totally electronic passive measurement for all the platforms. There's a TV measure which will be wired to the set, and that'll capture all of the viewing and provide demos. Panelists' homes will also be installed with a special router configured by Google to capture all online usage from PCs, cell phones, and most importantly, tablets, or equally importantly, in the home. And because we know the holy grail of measurement is both in and out of the home, Android phone owners in this panel will download metering software to permit us to experiment with an untethered meter, one that you can carry around. And if the download meter works, we'll gradually swap out the tethered meter and begin to collect out-of-home data as well. So we're about to go into the field to ramp up that panel, and we'll see how we do with the software meter. Now, of course, a sample of 3,000 is gargantuan compared to what we've had in previous studies, and it's going to give us the ability to slice and dice cross-platform behavior, 4-screen cross-platform, as never before. Now, while the Google and the ComScore studies might appear similar, there are some very different approaches. There's panelist self-reports for ComScore, and there's downloadable monitoring and special Wi-Fi software for Google. And as I said, one of the things about the billion-dollar lab is that we're also trying to understand best practices of measurement. And the plan we have is to come back to you all after and to share with you what we learned about what some of these measurement techniques, which ones worked, and maybe have some viability and which ones didn't. But as Billy Mays used to say, but there's even more. We're going to be talking to 500 folks daily with knowledge networks in a nationally representative sample that will help us understand behaviors and attitudes regarding all of their Olympic consumption, both in and out of the home. The great thing is we've done this now since Beijing, so we have terrific norms and data where we can track changes over time. And then finally, Arbitron and out of home. With the amount of video or content all day, and the fact that there's a big time difference, we think out-of-home viewing will be very, very significant in London. And Arbitron is going to use their 70,000 personal people meter panel to help us measure and track out-of-home viewing of the Olympics. And of course, the thing that cross-platform offers us is simultaneous usage, and the growth of a new kind of consumer, the SIMUS, the simultaneous media user. Now, we first saw this phenomenon emerge in the Vancouver Games. So here's what we learned about simultaneous. And again, this is just 2 years ago, but lots have changed. First of all, about a third of the people who consumed the Olympics during Vancouver were doing it on 2 screens simultaneously somewhere along the line. Could have been every day, could have been once, but it was a third. And secondly, their age and their sex, gender, were pretty well balanced. There was no real, interesting skews. And the other thing is that over half of all the mobile WAP and app users were simultaneous users of the Olympics. They were watching it while they held it in their hand and using it. And that takes me to mobile. Mobile wasn't ready for prime time in Vancouver, but unquestionably, things have changed. The growth of smartphones hasn't really been that big from 2010 to 2012, and the reason is it's pretty well penetrated. It's virtually universal. But take a look at the number of smartphones. Back at Vancouver, only about 1 in 4 of the smartphones, of the handhelds were smartphones that could use video and really good web interaction. Well, by the time we get to London, we expect that almost half of all handsets will be smartphones, enabling people to really have a much different viewer experience. And if you take a look at the growth of that's a 69% bump. And if you take a look at the growth of the mobile web itself, during Beijing, it was about 43 million uniques. In February of 2010, it was about 67 million. And this year, the growth has exploded to 122 million, almost triple the number during Beijing 4 years ago. So the mobile pump is definitely primed. And here's another way to look at it. When we did Beijing, there were about 300,000 videos viewed during the Beijing Olympics. By the time we got to Vancouver, it was 2 million, a 500% increase. And in fact, and this is kind of interesting, the use of mobile in Vancouver eclipsed Beijing after only 3 days. And as I said earlier, the mobile platform is mainstreaming. Back in Beijing, this was the age distribution, and I noticed the 50-plus users at about 15%. Well, this is what it was like just 2 years later in Vancouver. It virtually doubled to almost a third. And I kind of look at older users as sort of an indicator of mainstreaming. And if that doesn't convince you, know that 7 out of 10 Vancouver mobile users never use mobile in Beijing. So I think we have a lot we're going to be seeing. And the same thing has to do with the app. And again, you just got to step back and realize that what we're looking at today just didn't exist then. It's hard to believe that during Beijing, the Apple Store had about 800 apps. 2 years later, that grew to about 240,000. And now there are over 500,000 apps that are online. So once again, mobile will be a very significant factor. Another thing is social media. Now, I know that you guys probably heard more about social media the last 2 days than any human being should have to endure. But the fact of the matter is, it's very, very real, and it's growing. And we think that the Olympics will help us really begin to understand some of it in some very profound ways. 158 million social network users in the States, over half the population. About 141 million are on Facebook, again, domestically, are users, I should say. And about 28 million Twitter users with 65 million tweets coming out. So a lot's going on. Our measurement of social media has also come a long way. Back in Beijing, in 2008, the best we could do was basically try to see what kind of online conversation was occurring around the Olympics. But that was awfully primitive. Then by the time we got to Vancouver, we were able to measure the word of mouth about Olympic advertisers, and we could identify their visits to various social media sites. And Twitter had started to blossom, and so we were following that as well. And we did it with this kind of cool dashboard, which was called the Olympic Twitter Tracker. And what this was that it visually identifies the nature of the tweets happening in real time, and the size of the picture represents the number or the traffic, the amount of tweets that were going on. So this snapshot was sometime around 10 o'clock in prime time when we were showing Lindsey Vonn's race for the gold medal. Our programmers used it to understand how viewers were reacting to their program choices, but in London, everybody in this room, the public, will be able to see what people are doing using the Twitter tracker. And by the way, one very interesting factoid. There was only one event during the Vancouver Olympics, or one sport, that never completely disappeared from the Twitter tracker. Yes, curling. Well, our social media measurement, I think, will be much more sophisticated for London. We'll be able to track activity and trends around individual sports, the athletes, topics and issues, as well as the conversations around our major advertisers. So, for example, we've got initiatives by 2 interesting companies. One is Bluefin Media. What they're going to do is provide us with social media conversations surrounding the broadcast, the athletes, the sports, and the commercials. And another by Media Solutions, an organization that's going to help us try to understand the role of influencers, measuring who these guys are, the content that fuels it, and where they go and how they share that. We hope to really understand how influencers work, and maybe we can be able to leverage their activities for both programming and sales going forward. And speaking of sales, at the end of the day, someone's got to pay for all this stuff. The $1 billion lab is kind of a joke, but that's what the rights fees are. So sales are really important. And a significant part of our sales effort is to provide advertisers with tangible research that shows the advertiser's effectiveness. In other words, we want to give them ROI to justify the cost of their Olympic spend. In Vancouver, one of the most fascinating things we did was a partnership with Google. And it's actually very straightforward. We simply found where the time a particular spot hit. And then we looked at the corresponding searches. So for example, this was an example at 8:45 of a spot for British Columbia tourism. And that big spike there is the actual Google searches that occurred immediately thereafter. And if you look over to the right, you see that second spike at about 11:45. That was the replay on the West Coast of the Olympics, and again, that's when that spot ran. So I don't think is a more compelling demonstration of the direct relationship between exposure and behavior than this kind of methodology, and we plan to use a lot of it during the next Olympics. The thing that's so great from a sales perspective about the Olympics, it is just a hugely powerful advertising platform. I'm a research guy. I know you won't believe this, but sometimes numbers get spun. No need to spin the Olympics. It just really works. Whether it's brand recall, whether it's message recall, whether it's things like likability, what we're showing here is that the dual platform messaging that the Olympics really offers our advertisers results in an enormous lift versus those people who are exposed simply to an ad on television alone. But we're going to try to move that forward by measuring four-platform, four-screen advertising, and we're going to use Latitude to help us do that. They're going to give us exposure on awareness and behavior metrics. We'll also be able to get demographic profiles of how the exposure on the four platforms affected advertising, and finally, how each of those platforms intersected and worked together. Well, I hope you see that the breadth and depth of the research initiatives that we will employ is pretty big. Let me synthesize what we think the major headlines are going to be in research for the Olympics. First, certainly cross-platform will be huge, it'll be pervasive and increasingly mainstream. Tablets, I think they're going to play a very significant role. The simultaneous media user will become a larger, more mainstream, more active group. Mobile is definitely going to be ready for prime time. And we expect to see a lot of mobile activity both inside and outside the home. And by the way, you know, most mobile activity occurs in the home, not outside. It's sort of counterintuitive. And finally, you know, if there's one word to describe our current media environment, it's fractionalization. I mean, it is very, very, very hard to aggregate a lot of people to experience something at the same time. And I think that to a large extent, people are hungering for the ability to share a shared experience. And so we believe that the Olympics is going to offer that, and we believe that it's social media that will facilitate it. And so that's really one of the things that we're going to be looking at very closely. So that's how my colleagues and I will be spending our summer vacation working on the London Olympic Lab. And it's all going to begin in 121 days.